Hi everyone. This is the first of two lectures for the module on extended family. In this module, and particularly in this set of lecture slides, we're going to focus most specifically on grandparents. And we're going to be looking at what grandparent-grandchild communication looks like and why. What are some factors that influence that communication? And we're also going to be looking at something called the sandwich generation, which is not necessarily discussed much in your textbook, so you want to make sure to definitely pay attention in these lecture slides to learn what that is. The next set of lecture slides will examine the various theories related to grandparent-grandchild interaction. So the first thing I think we should do is take a look at what we mean by extended family. Your book identifies extended family as social relationships among those that are related by blood, law, or, I like that they've added, self-ascribed associations that extends beyond the marriage or committed partner couple and the immediate family of parenting adults and dependent children. So basically, everything else that we haven't yet talked about in this class, right? In this class, we've covered romantic relationships, we covered the parent-child subsystem with siblings, but we haven't yet covered things like grandparents, aunts and uncles, in-laws, cousins, and so on, right? They can all be described as our extended family. When we're looking at grandparents and the role that grandparents play within family structure, there's a couple of interesting trends that I want you to make sure that you think about and are aware of. The first one is the idea that today, more people are likely to have grandparents when they are born. And I guess that maybe should say more people are likely to have grandparents who are still living when they are born, right? If we were in class right now, we'd be able to take a little bit of a poll to see how many of you have living grandparents, maybe even have living great-grandparents. What I have noticed when I do take that poll is that almost everyone in the class raises their hand, and many students report that they have multiple living grandparents. We've already talked about some reasons why that might be in this class. Probably the biggest reason, of course, is simply the idea that people are living longer today than in previous decades. As we've already previously discussed, the average length of life is longer for both males and females now than in previous years. So that's part of what's going on with the first bullet point there. Below that, though, you can see that although more people are likely to be born with living grandparents, at the same time, more people are likely to be grandchildless right now. And so what that's saying is that older adults are more likely not to have any grandchildren. So it seems that those concepts might be a little bit contradictory, but when you think about this idea, I think we can kind of see how both trends can kind of coexist, right? Why are more people grandchildless today than ever before? Well, again, I think we can look at some trends that we've already discussed. The first being that people in general are waiting to have children, right? As we discussed, that people are waiting to get married and people are waiting to have children longer than in previous decades. And so adults who in previous generations may have already would already likely have had grandchildren at this point, may still not have grandchildren. In addition to that, we know that not only are some people waiting longer to have children, more people are choosing not to have children, right? So that also can contribute to this. When you put those two things together, it does lead us to this concept of model age, which your book discusses briefly. And that is simply the idea that we tend to have societal expectations for ages at which people hit certain milestones, right? And certainly this is true of grandparenting, right? And so I'd ask you just to kind of think about what you think the model age or the kind of socially expected age for becoming a grandparent is. I've asked that question of students before, and I've gotten responses that vary, right? Some people may say 50, 55, others may say 60, 65. But generally speaking, the consensus is that for the first time for someone to become a grandparent, we tend to anticipate that to happen sometime 50s, maybe early 60s-ish, right? So given that we do have this kind of societal expectation, we know that when individuals do not hit that milestone during that expected time because they become grandparents either earlier or later, then we call that off-time grandparenting. Right? So if you happen to become a grandparent in your 30s, or even maybe in your early 40s, you might be considered an off-time grandparent. On the flip side, if you don't become a grandparent, like my grandfather did not become a grandparent until he was 72. That's a little older than societal norms might predict. Okay. What we know is when you are grandparenting off time, it can definitely lead into additional stressors and conflict. Okay. The stressors and the conflict might come from a lack of expectations about how to fulfill the role. Perhaps you are the only one among your social group or your friends or family that is a grandparent. And so you don't have people to turn to compare experiences with, or maybe you don't have the same support that others who are all grandparenting together have. Right? And so, so we know that off-time grandparenting can be a little bit tricky. Your book does describe a handful of different grandparent-grandchild relationships. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at each one of these different styles here, but I encourage you to take a look at these labels and to go through your chapter and look at some of the descriptions of each one of these labels, and to even think a little bit about where you might categorize your own personal experiences and what type of grandparents you may have had the opportunity to interact with, whether that is influential or passive grandparents, or maybe you have the fun seeker grandparent that was identified in the previous typology. So I'm going to ask you to kind of take a look at that on your own. The last factor that influences the relationship is parental divorce. Again, if parents are ones who kind of serve as gatekeepers, then if parents divorce, that really can influence the relationship between grandchildren and grandparents. Right? In cases where a divorce might be messy or particularly complicated, an ex-spouse might not be interested in and might in fact avoid allowing a grandchild to see a grandparent on the other side of the family. Okay, so the last concept I'd like to take a minute to talk about is the sandwich generation. Your book doesn't really mention too much about this, but maybe you've heard about it somewhere in news or media or something like that. Maybe you're already familiar with it. But if you're not, you make sure you pay close attention to these lecture slides because this will be on the exam. But the sandwich generation, it's really just defined as adults who find themselves in a circumstance where they are raising their offspring, raising their children, while simultaneously now also caring for aging parents. So they're kind of sandwiched in between these two different generations. Right? There are more people who can be defined as the sandwich generation now than ever before. Right? And there are a couple of factors for that. Of course, one of the factors being one that we've talked about a lot. People are simply living longer. Right? So your grandparents may be living longer than ever before. In addition to that, or couple that with the fact that we are talking about a baby boomer generation here, where the size of the aging population is bigger now than in previous decades. So if you look at this particular data here, you can see that people that have a parent that are 65 plus and are still raising their own children represent, in 2012, represented about 47% of the adult population. That was up from a few years prior, and I am sure is continuing to rise. Okay. You can see that this particular bar chart asks not just about supporting, but specifically financial support. And again, you can see that those numbers are going up. So we know that the sandwich generation is prevalent, right? As people are in this circumstance. If we were in class together, it'd be interesting to have a conversation with you all to see how many of you might suggest that your parents are part of this sandwich generation. When we look at the outcomes associated with being a part of the sandwich generation, we can see that in general, people tend to report that they are, people don't tend to report significant differences in satisfaction, but people within the sandwich generation do report feeling kind of stressed or always rushed, right? So if you look here at this bar chart, it's comparing in the dark green, the sandwich generation compared to other adults in terms of whether they would report being very happy with their life. You can see, to me, both these numbers seem a little bit low, but you can see that there's really no statistical difference between level of happiness or satisfaction between people in the sandwich generation and those that are not. On the other hand, you come down here and in response to the question, do you always feel rushed? You can see that the sandwich generation responses, or that more people in the sandwich generation did answer yes to that question versus people, other adults in the general population. Okay, so certainly something that's kind of interesting to think about. When I was growing up, at least for a few years, I remember my grandfather did come to stay with us. And as a young child, I remember loving it and really enjoying the experience and just being really happy to have him around. I do remember a few instances where there were a couple arguments here or there, or kind of my parents, really that's what I remember the most, my parents kind of having a little bit of tension. As they were dealing with this particular living arrangement. But ultimately, I have really, really positive memories of the experience. So it certainly is interesting to think about, knowing that this sandwich generation is a very prevalent, and is probably just going to continue to rise. You can think about what are some outcomes associated with this circumstance for not only the grandchildren, but also the adults and the grandparents as well. All right, so I will stop there at this point. We've introduced the idea of grandparents and various factors that influence the grandparent-grandchild interaction. Remember, the next set of slides, we'll look at some theory that helps us better understand this particular family subsystem.